The intent of this writ is not to rake up old wounds, but rather I wanted you to appreciate the freedom you have and how much faith and works it took your ancestors to obtain such for you, so that you, my posterity, might be born in the land of the free and inherit the blessings thereof as loyal citizens. Normally I would not have written this explicit eyewitness account because of its sensitive nature regarding the underlying causes of World War II. It is not my intention to make anyone feel uncomfortable nor irate, but how else can I tell the story but in truth?
The Versailles Treaty in 1919 established the groundwork for the Second World War. Political unrest slowly spread throughout Germany. The fatherland was ripe for new leadership. Unfortunately, this new leadership came in the likes of Adolf Hitler, who slowly succumbed the nation into war against Europe and her allies. Germany's attack on Europe soon included its former ally Russia. A long and bloody war ensued, resulting in millions of Russian casualties and POWs. Many soldiers and civilians died cruel deaths. The Allies, especially Russia, would not forget the Nazi aggression. Hatred between these countries had taken on new meaning, and as the ending of the war hastened, so did payback. German civilians, like this young boy, would soon pay the price of revenge. The following account is the price that was paid.
Wir haben uns die beste Luftabwehr geschaffen und die beste Tankabwehr, die es in der Welt gibt. Es ist have the best tanks and the best anti-aircraft in the world.
If the battle is to be won, we must provide our men with ever-increasing quantities of the weapons and ammunition they need. We must have, and have quickly, more aeroplanes, more tanks, more shells, more guns. There is imperious need for these vital munitions.
Ich habe Waffenlose kein Angeboten, solange Stellen liegen. Nachdem man das ablehnte, hab ich allein.
At the same time, our heavy bombers are striking nightly at the taproot of German mechanized power.
I, Henri, was born of goodly parents of Christian persuasion in Greifenberg, eastern Pomerania. We lived in a nice ancient Prussian walled city with a garrison in it. I remember before the war the dragoons riding on their black horses, holding lances as they proceeded through the gate of the city wall. Their horses were well fed, and their saddles and boots were made of shiny brown leather. It was a great sight to behold. We had also an infantry regiment and an artillery battalion with horse-drawn carriages and heavy howitzers. All of these young and well-trained soldiers ended up in Stalingrad, Russia, where they were lost during the siege and later in the encirclement. Our garrison replacement consisted of French foreign legionnaires who had joined the German Waffen-SS, which was a well-supplied elite foreign fighting unit. I remember them marching through our cobblestone streets singing Légionnaire de la France, Légionnaire Belle Alliance. They were wearing German uniforms with blue, white, red shoulder pads and France marked on them. We were told by the propaganda ministry that we are only shortening our lines of defense and by doing so inflicting heavy casualties upon our enemies. In reality, there were insufficient supplies of food, clothing, fuel, ammunition, weapons, and manpower available to hold the line. One blustery snowy morning a policeman came to our neighborhood and went door to door informing us that we had to evacuate our home, that the Russians had broken through the lines and were only 17 kilometers away from us. We sat around our warm tile-covered oven, stunned and with unbelief in our countenance. My mother just knit another pair of socks and would not move. All of our properties were paid off in full only 6 months ago, and a snowstorm was raging outside. What could we do? It was getting dark, and we could see the artillery flashes on the horizon. My mother was in a deep thinking mode, and my brother Claude and I finally persuaded her to start packing our handcart as the artillery flashes became more noticeable. My mother, being brought up on a farm, knew what to pack for such an emergency in midwinter. She would have made an excellent Boy Scout. Besides packing extra winter clothing, blankets, mats, and socks, feather thicks or comforters, raincoats, pots and pans and food, a few pictures and birth certificates, she also managed to run into the chicken house to fill up 2 potato bags full of chickens, which we tied to our 4-wheeled hand wagon. We left our acreage in a hurry and were on the highway by 4:30 p.m. We took the highway towards Kameen in the direction of the older river estuary in a hope to escape Russian encirclement. We pulled our handcart that evening and the whole night, as well as all next day till evening without stopping. My mother plucked a chicken and we had roasted chicken on a spit. We rested there after for the night in that forest. At daybreak our hurried journey resumed. By this time the highways had only one-way traffic, 3 lines abreast of galloping horses pulling farm wagons, mixed with refugees pulling handcarts. We eventually reached the city of Kameen, from where we had to travel northward towards Divano. It was the only escape route across the Divano River of the Oder estuary onto the island of Volyn. However, there were several problems. A highway from the south, one from the north, and one from the northeast on which we were on, all packed 3 lines abreast with wildly fleeing horse-drawn wagons and handcarts. They were all converging onto the only highway leading north to the bridge and to safety. on which we were on, all packed 3 lines abreast, with wildly fleeing horse-drawn wagons and handcarts. They were all converging onto the only highway leading north to the bridge and to safety. Artillery was shooting overhead, and the Russian tanks, with mounted infantry on them, were already on the far end of the column. The German soldiers were overturning some of the farm wagons as a defensive barrier. From hence they waited with bazookas and handheld anti-tank rockets called Panzerfaust to stop the advance of the Russian tanks. In the meantime, on the other side of the river, among all the noise we saw and heard, the German Dornier flying boats, similar to the PBY floating aircraft, revving their engines and taking off while under artillery fire. All from the terminal and runways my father had worked on before the war. These terminals and aircraft were packed with wounded soldiers. In all this confusion, looking at galloping scared horses, my 10-year-old sister Elsa let go of her hold on our fast-moving handcart and stood in the middle of the traffic circle by herself. I darted out to retrieve her just in time. Some of the older soldiers just threw their rifles into the ditch and started running. They thought that they had it made and that the war was over for them. They were wrong. We saw them later on our second handcart track as they bypassed us, column after column of German POWs, surrounded by armed Cossacks guards on horses as they made their way down the road in their pitiful state as starved, mistreated, ill, and badly clothed prisoners, heading for the Siberian forced labor camps on foot. It eventually became a 2,500 kilometer ride in cold, unheated railroad boxcars for them, followed by a walk to Never Never Land, where human life has no value, or in all too many cases a walk to the land of no return, because the latter starved or froze to death. My brother Claude got brave. He actually pulled one too young-looking skinny boy who was dressed in a German uniform away from the guarded line of prisoners by waiting for the guard to ride past us and then pulling this guy into the bushes where we were and hiding him. He figured that fellow was his age and too young to walk into captivity. Now back to our first escape. We actually got onto the highway to Divino, which led to the bridge across the Divino River, by pulling our handcarts through the ditches, thereby bypassing the congested highway and the traffic which had stalled by now. The bridge was 12 kilometers away, and it took us several hours to get there on foot while pulling our cart. My Uncle Eric from Teslahagen was an invalid and not as lucky. He and his team of horses and wagon were run over and squashed to death by a rapidly advancing Russian tank, we were later told by eyewitnesses. The approach to the bridge had steep embankments on which German rapid-firing 20mm anti-aircraft cannons were perched. The bridge had also a railroad crossing with concrete abutments. We were just getting near them when low-flying American aircraft appeared, firing at the masses of humanity converging onto the bridge. In a mad dash, we made it just under the concrete railroad overpass, with cannon fire hitting the wall just 2 yards away from us. Somebody from above just looked after. In the meantime, a platoon of very youthful and exuberant-looking German army conscripts of the Volkssturm, who could not have been more than 15 to 16 years of age, drove in on motorcycles with sidecars. They had on them machine guns and anti-tank rockets. They took up position hurriedly at the cellar windows and houses near the bottom of the bridge embankments, waiting for the Russian tanks with their mounted infantry to make their appearance. 30 tow tanks in all, with their mounted infantry sitting on them, rolled into the embankments leading to the bridge. The German youthful defenders took aim at the Soviets' tanks from the basement windows with their anti-tank rockets, firing at the thinner sides of the tanks, concentrating on the first three and on the last three tanks of the column, thereby boxing them in. The rapid-firing 20mm anti-aircraft cannons on the top of the embankment joined in and decimated the Russian infantry which was sitting on the tanks. These poor guys were sitting ducks. The Russian tanks were unable to get enough elevation with their gun barrels and could not get a round off, whereas the infantry with their drum-tight machine pistols had not the same range as the 20mm anti-aircraft guns with their shields on them. The net result was a short firefight with all 32 tanks out of action and the enemy being stopped in its tracks, so to speak, at least until the second wave of attack. This gave us an opportunity to hastily cross the bridge to the other side. By evening, having it made to the opposite side of the river onto the island of Wollin, we sought shelter on a veranda with concrete floor that had no windows left, but it had a roof to shelter us from snow. We had hardly laid down for a much-needed rest when a further massive Russian advance commenced. We heard a large explosion resulting from the big bridge being blown up by the German army in an effort to stop the further advance of the Russian troops. In the meantime, the remnant of the German Navy, namely the 15,000-ton German heavy cruiser or pocket battleship Deutschland with its 6 11-inch or 28-centimeter cannons and 6-inch secondary armament, and the light cruiser Nuremberg with its 6-inch or 15-centimeter main armament, plus 3 destroyers, took aim at the Russian tanks from the Oder River estuary at point blank, this resulting in the line of defense being held on the northern front until the hostilities ceased. Our next objective was Swinemünde, the last major warship harbor, which was situated between the islands of Usedom and Wollin on the Swine River. We crossed the island of Wollin, pulling our wagon without difficulty. We tried to catch a train and a ferry in Swinemünde, which would bring us to safety to the west. The train was parked in a heavily wooded section of the forest and could not be seen by low-flying aircraft, unless they followed the tracks from above. At midday we spotted a Mosquito twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft, and we were sure that the Yankee bombers would pay us a visit. The American aircraft was looking at the warships below and several troop transport ships, which were in the process of loading German troops, tanks and ammunition and supplies destined for Courland, a peninsula near Riga. As soon as the reconnaissance aircraft had left, all of the German fleet and transports put out to sea. They did not want to be sitting ducks. Several hours later, when it was getting dark, the Allied bombers showed up and blew the empty ducks to smithereens. By that time, we had crossed the Swine onto the island of Usedom and boarded a ship that would bring us across the Stettiner Haff to Ueckermünde, which was situated on the shores of the mainland and later to Pasewalk. We landed on the estate of Klaus Freiherr or Freeman, Count von Schlieffen, in Drölitz, Kreis Güstrow, near Lage, at midnight. We were put in a stable of a large tick-infested piggery for the night. In the morning a gendarme came by to question all of these undesirable-looking refugees who were occupying the pig pens. Lucky for us that the policeman found out that I attended the very same college and classes as Rudolf von Tattenfriedlaff, a former member of the Polish exiled royal household. We were summoned to the Schloss or mansion of the estate to report to the whereabouts of the von Tattens. The forester's house was emptied of its occupants and we became the new occupant. We thought that we were finally safe in this location, but the Russian troops had slashed through the middle of Germany by late spring of 1945 by passing the northern coastal line, and on the 7th of May 1945 we watched German horse-drawn artillery howitzers driving hurriedly cross-country through the grain fields for their new positions. Then we saw next a long line of Russian 64-ton Stalin tanks with their long barrel 122mm cannons driving down the highway leading to a large fenced-off, once secret V-weapons rocket arsenal. There was more realism and action to it than a Rambo or a Schwarzenegger movie could offer. We stood at the top of an anti-tank ditch approximately 1 kilometer from the highway, watching the spectacle unfold as all of a sudden a huge cloud arose to the altitude the same as a high-flying bomber. To our surprise, the ensuing shockwave knocked us backwards into the anti-tank ditch. The Germans had blown the whole V-weapons depot into the air, giving us and the nearby Russian tank crew a severe headache. The ensuing evening brought with it plunder and drinking and mass rape of the German women and girls by the Russian conquerors. It started on one end of the village and proceeded from house to house like a locust infestation. When hearing the crying and sobbing of women, my mother, sister, brother, and I slipped out of the rear window of the house before these rapists were able to unlock the front door. We quietly and quickly left our abode at night and slept in the forest. I remember one night as we were under our blankets, a wild mother pig with her piglings running through our little hideaway in the forest. These were real unscheduled Boy Scout outings. We were listening to the spirit. Many of those who had only one option of escape left, namely last-minute evacuation by ship, drowned in the frigid waters of the wintry Baltic Sea off the coast of eastern Pomerania, after being torpedoed by Russian submarines. Strenuous escape from the Russians during the winter seemed almost for nothing. My family and I had pulled the handcarts through the deep snow, 30 to 35 below zero, with our meager belongings while fleeing from the advancing Russian front. We marched on foot through 2.5 provinces, while being sometimes under artillery fire and aircraft attack, only to be eventually overtaken by the Russians. Out of necessity, we would sleep in ditches beside the roads, for houses were burned out and in ruins. They had no window panes and no heat nor roofs. We pushed away some snow, put our raincoats on the ground, covered it with a blanket and 2 feather bag type comforters, then another blanket, 2 more raincoats, and a pile of snow. The 4 of us, my mother, brother Klaus, and my sister Elsa and I, sandwiched ourselves between the feather bags or comforters many a night, while the artillery barrage could be heard overhead. This is how we survived the winter. Many refugees simply froze to death. I'm glad that my mother made sure that we loaded our feather bags and raincoats onto the handcart. The former were part of our handmade dowry, which all farmers' daughters or brides would make themselves. World War II was now officially over. The Russians celebrated every day. They went on a shopping spree by plundering and stealing everything in sight. Some of them had never seen wristwatches before. Now they wore several on each arm, stopping people and saying, "Urek, Urek." They wanted to take away everyone's wristwatch, or ur. as well as jewelry and in some cases wedding bands. The Russians made an escaped convict from the ball and chain gang the mayor of our town. The latter still wore the uniform when he came to town. He became the #1 communist. We were required to work on the huge estate which became now a communist-run farm. There were 22 teams of horses, each team having 3 horses and pulling a 2-furrow walk-behind type plow, and another 30 teams of brown-spotted oxen, each team consisting of 2 oxen, pulling the same type of 2-furrow plow. My brother Klaus and I were given each a team of oxen, and we walked barefoot behind the plows in May. In return, we got very little food in the community kitchen, where you had to watch your food on a large shared wood-fired grill or stove, or it would take on a disappearing act. So much for communal cooking. To make things worse, the woman folks had to hide each night from the Russian predators. Our second-hand cart trek began shortly after World War II had ended. We were lucky enough to acquisition a horse. It was blind, but we could lead it. We took an iron-rimmed wooden-wheeled wagon from the estate that was meant for a team of 2 horses and made a makeshift tongue to pull it. We shared the wagon with another family who had more grown-ups. Our trip lasted only for 13 kilometers when the horse was taken from us by our famous overlords. We divided the wagon, and it became our lot to tie our belongings onto the rear axle assembly. The stronger family took the front part with the tongue on it. Lucky for us, we found out that the taller rear wheels were easier to pull in the long run. We decided to take a different route because there was no ship service across the islands. This is where we saw some of the greatest calamities. I witnessed the mass rape of innocent children and women animal on all 4 limbs, while these subhuman species took turns in mass rape, just 20 feet away from us. My cousins were mass raped by Russian soldiers, then locked up in their own barn and burned to death after the foul deed. These farmers paid a horrible price just as bystanders for something that they had no part of, especially the very young. Another occasion when my family and I were sleeping in a room that we shared with a young woman and her 2 small children, Russian soldiers came into the room, and one of them pushed the 2 little children to one side of the bed and raped this young woman just approximately 10 feet away from us. Some heroes they were. I remember some fleeing farmers trying to hide their wives and daughters under their baggage and bags of oats in their horse-drawn farm wagons. They were either shot to death or beaten to their knees while trying to defend their womenfolks from mass rape. I recall the Soviets pressing their drum-type machine pistols against the chest of these old family men, yelling "Stoy" and some other words I won't mention. They were held at bay at the threat of death, whereas some were actually shot to death. One woman resisted vigorously until a Soviet soldier shot off the thumb of her baby. On the other hand, we were also forewarned by a Russian not to continue on one particular highway because it went past a distillery where many of his comrades had gathered for free drinks of rye and where rape was the norm. Needless to say, we took a large detour on a sandy country road to avoid the guests of the distillery. The moral of the story is there are 2 types of people everywhere: those who are decent and care and those who don't. As a result of the war and rape, to some of my surviving cousins, one half or part Russian children were born, so I do not want to paint too bleak a picture for their sakes. In sum total, we returned home by walking back to the same devastated 2.5 provinces. We were looking forward to sleeping in our own beds after such a long and arduous journey, only to find our home destroyed by artillery fire. The city had changed hands 7 times. The French foreign legionnaires from the Waffen-SS garrison ran out of ammunition and fuel several times, but after being resupplied would retake the city each time. Needless to say, there was much devastation in some areas of the city, and the bridge across the Rega River was blown up. Our former neighbors was a pretty young woman who lived in her upstairs apartment. Her husband had not yet returned from the Eastern Front, and she had just given birth to her first baby on the same day the Russians showed up. She was also mass raped by these uncultivated beings who wore Russian uniforms that very day. Our neighbor from across the road, named Billy Girls, had a good business manufacturing, inscribing, and polishing gravestones with the free help of French POWs. He was a real Nazi and drove a DKW sports car during the war. He had even gas to spare. This fellow was a shrewd opportunist, and he was known as the Judas Iscariot of our hometown. He was a chameleon, an instant communist, and stood at the walled city gate and pointed out all his former friends and associates to the Russians and to the Polish police or militia. That may sound fine, but you see, on the German existing laws of the Third Reich, if you had a job as a civil servant, letter carrier, teacher, railroad station master, or in any other public service as a clerk, you had to be in the party, if you liked it or not. Can you imagine how many families, mainly women and children, with their breadwinners still missing on the Eastern Front, got carted to jail and shot because of this fellow? And the jobs these husbands once held were not even party related. They just had earned a living as civil servants. It was said that this fellow would sell his own grandmother for a mere sandwich. Crises of this magnitude really bring out the character of mankind or the lack thereof. Our daily working routine of forced labor included unloading potatoes in the field from horse-drawn wagons. They were large potato bags weighing approximately 80 to 100 pounds each, which was more than we ourselves weighed, and then we planted the potatoes on bended back. It was a struggle, and later on we picked up and carted bricks from the ruins. Our reward was some very watered-down kapusta soup, meaning cabbage soup, with very few potatoes in it and no meat, just a bit of salt, plus one little piece of dry bread once a day. We experienced forced labor besides starvation. 6 weeks later, we were escorted on the so-called Polish armed protection, or rather rape and plunder, away from our homeland. This was our 3rd handcart trek, but with fewer belongings. You know, these things are really very difficult to write about because of intermarriage within our own larger family, which include very good souls from Eastern Europe. Nevertheless, here are some excerpts of our pilgrimage. My 72-year-old Uncle Julius Doppelfool was beaten to death with a rifle butt by 2 of our young fanatical conquerors because he could not climb the ladder fast enough into the hayloft in order to throw down some hay to feed the livestock. To put the following into perspective, I want you to understand that it is always a few mean fanatics who make the rest of the people of different nationalities look bad. In reality, there are also many other good-hearted people among each nation. I just happened to witness firsthand some of the worst of the lot. The new owners of the land compelled us to walk to the Russian-occupied zone, like a herd of helpless sheep. This was our third long-distance forced march through the same foodless 2.5 provinces, where people were starving and decomposing bodies of both humans and animals were laying on the road. Just imagine the stench. An altogether bleak picture for us civilians. Our so-called armed protective Polish escorts plundered our poor refugee column of its last belongings. Our next-door neighbor's 17-year-old daughter was foolish enough to wear her new tall red leather boots for this journey. She was a college student. The escorts grabbed her and pulled off her boots. She had to wrap rags around her feet for the rest of the journey. These fellows took everything of worth, such as food, jewelry, and so forth. During the hassle over some fancy wedding and engagement rings, an old woman was pulled into the ditch. She had arthritic finger knuckles, and our conquerors could not pull off her rings. These crafty fellows just cut off her finger when they could not get the rings off otherwise. I had hidden my mother's plain wedding ring and our birth documents and other valuables by sewing them into the lining of my old dilapidated dirty head. So they were saved, but we lost our last bit of food to them. We had previously scavenged a bombed-out ammunition train, which had also a boxcar attached to it which contained bags of brown sugar. People were like ants all over the boxcar. We had managed to get 25 pounds of this precious commodity for ourselves. This was the only food we had, and we rationed it by eating only 1/2 a cup per family member per day, while the armed Poles took our sugar under the pretext of searching for weapons, which we would hardly harbor under such conditions. It was summer by now, and we survived on wild berries and on 1-year-old potatoes that were left in earth mounds. The latter were soft like rubber. There was no food at all in the stores. Many of them were burned to the ground, so we did not have to dread going shopping in a crowded superstore like some of us do today. There was not even one morsel to be found. We just scavenged the ruins for last year's leftovers. We walked during 4 journeys on foot, a total distance almost equal in mileage from Ottawa, Ontario to Manitoba. It was our first pilgrimage beginning in midwinter. We met also many good-hearted people from other nations on our handcart trek. Some of them were very helpful and real good Christians, whereas others were the opposite and very hostile. While on our handcart trek, we met 2 Russian soldiers who stopped their truck and motioned us to come over to them. Being wary of previous ill treatments, we did not dare go near them for our mother's and 10-year-old sister's sake. These 2 Russian soldiers looked like World War II veterans who had seen a lot. They lowered the rear truck gate, put something on the pavement, and drove off with their arms waving at us. When we finally got near the spot, we discovered to our surprise that it was a big chunk of raw beef wrapped in paper. A guardian angel must have sent them, because we were totally exhausted and starving. This was the only meat we had for the last 6 months. We went quickly off a side road back into the woods, and my mother cooked the beef, and we ate all of it quickly for fear that someone would come along and take it away from us. The highways near the border were patrolled, so we set out cross-country on that evening of November 23, 1945. It was getting dark around 8 p.m. We set our course by the dark silhouette of the taller trees, always keeping in mind our previous bearing when looking for the next tree, in order to have always the barely discernible silhouettes of 3 tall trees in the same line of sight, so that we would not lose our direction during our night travel. We approached some farmhouses to beg some bread, but they would not let us in, being fearful and they didn't want to compromise themselves. We finally spotted a lit-up highway, which was a heavily guarded border crossing. We proceeded approximately 2 kilometers south of the crossing towards a wooded area and found obstacles, including a wall of dried-up tree branches in our way, which blocked a path into the woods. We removed the ladder piece by piece, went through the opening, and replaced the branches carefully in the same manner. By this time, the overcast had given way to some intermittent periods of moonlight as we walked through the wooded area that was covered with some leafless blueberry bushes. I almost hooked with my foot behind a low-slung thin copper wire. We figured that it may have a bell attached to it, which my brother happened to see. My brother quickly pushed me away from it before I could trip it. We thought that this wire would lead to a Russian guard post and would have a bell attached to it and undoubtedly alerted them. We shortly thereafter spotted the actual multi-strand barbed wire fence of the border. The top looked like an electric wire. We were on a hill between fir trees and observed the border guards. At midnight, as we somehow expected, the guards left their post and formed a line like Mother Goose and her goslings, walking to the main building for the changing of the guards. We wasted no time and crouched to the fence on our elbows, infantry style. As a cloud began to cover the moon, we threw a tree branch upon the top wire of the fence and climbed across it into no man's land while staying low to the ground. After about 15 minutes of crawling through no man's land in the dark, we spotted another fence and crossed it in like manner. But to our surprise, when the moon blinked through the clouds again, we noticed Ivan swinging his arms and trying to keep circulation in his hands by rubbing them together on that cool night. We had ventured in accordance to our methodical and precise upbringing and thought that the border would follow a straight line instead of following a valley. We had crossed the jagged Russian border right into no man's land, but right back onto the Russian side, all within 20 minutes. Nobody had posted instructions and road maps for us as pertaining to the location of the border. Imagine how we felt, but having no alternative, we crawled back up the hill, through the bushes, into the forest, and there we waited all day for the next midnight change of the guard. In the daytime we were able to see parts of the British side, because there was a hustle and bustle in a nearby town where people were working and everything was lit up in the evening. At noon we saw a British-built Meteor jet fighter flying along the border, which was rather interesting to my brother, who had volunteered for the German Air Force. In the middle of the afternoon we saw 2 Russian guards making their way towards us. Maybe they had spotted us from their fire tower type observation towers, or it was just a routine border search. They walked just 1 row away from us, but towards us, in that planted forest of Christmas trees, the latter being about 7 feet tall. The lead guard in his open camouflage uniform, hooking behind the bare blueberry bushes, walking forward while being turned towards the other side and passing by us as we hid and slid around the bushy trees in order not to be seen, while the second guard was trying to pick up the first guard's one-man tent type camouflage overcoat. Both were brandishing a drum-type machine pistol. They would have shot us on sight at the border, because the only clothing that was available to us were discarded, worn-out army uniforms. I surely believe in God and in guardian angels. The only slightly comparable incident that I can think of is in the scriptures, where the eyes of the pursuers could not find the Savior while walking through the crowd right past them in midday, because their eyes were turned away. We thanked God and hid ourselves again until midnight. At midnight we went through the same maneuver and got into the no man's land again, undetected. This time we headed at a sharper angle towards a British border, anticipating a curve in the border. There came the next surprise. A slightly frozen over river right in the middle between the borders in no man's land. A 3-strand barbed wire spanned the river to the other side, which once served the farmers and stopped cattle during the summer from going into the neighboring fields. We were hoping that the old wire would hold our weight, since we only weighed a rickety 72 and 73 pounds respectively. We waited for cloud cover and slid our rucksack across the ice. Then I proceeded in a balancing act, standing on the lowest wire, which broke through the ice, and holding onto the top wire as I crossed hand over hand to the other side, where I jumped onto dry ground to safety. My brother followed, but was not so lucky in his jump to freedom. He missed the mark by a few feet and sank into the muddy water. He changed his socks and pants quickly, and we were off on our way, carefully approaching a border hamlet.